How do you choose your tempo? That's a question. Hello. First thing, conviction. If you're not convinced, you're not going to be persuasive. And what makes you persuaded is what you hear in your inner ear from the meaning of the piece. Forget studies, well, after you studied either, but you can also remember about your intuition, which brought you, most likely, in the first place, to play the piano. But combining knowledge and intuition is almost an explosive combination because one cancels the other in various degrees. Ideally, you should let the one impregnate you, which is the why, not the how. Why do I play this? What does it mean if I do? Or if I decide? The word character comes in mind. Of course, you can always argue that knowledge and rational knowledge helps to organize the thoughts. Okay, before 1720s, there was no metronome. Before 1820s, there was no metronome. It's barely around the last year of Beethoven's life in the mid-1820s that Melzel manufactures the metronome and copyrights it so that all the publishers write m.m equals how many beats per minute. Fine. But even that measure, which is objective, therefore rational, hasn't convinced conductors to conduct his retroactively marked tempi on his symphonies before he died, nor recordings of Stravinsky conducting his own works do other conductors today keep and sort of not move away from the tempo that the composer himself chose. So of course comes to the famous question, does the creator know anything about its creation? Is the creator in charge of the interpretation of his creation? After all, the composer is like a parent. You bring the child, you give an education to the child, you help the child become an adult, responsible, and at the same time taking individual incentives. But then all that comes in the word politeness. You study how to become successful and good at your field, if that is what you want to do, or try to help the others. But goodness is the strength of all, even if it appears a weakness to some. Politeness is not natural from birth, it's taught, and it becomes second nature when it's integrated in the behavior. All that to say that we are told that the meter matters, the indication of the composer matters on the score, and therefore the musician, polite, educated, cultivated, becomes a spokesman for the dead scroll score and makes it, literally puts it alive for the audience. Who's the audience? Is it a bunch of daydreamers who expect somebody to tell them a nice story and then leave the hall after? It's nice, it's possible. It's a storytelling business, and it's not even a business for most because it's not lucrative, in classical music at least. But nevertheless, it is very interesting to observe that even a knowledgeable, very knowledgeable audience who eventually knows the score doesn't need the performer to convince them that it's beautiful or why they like it. Could be the rhythm, the melody, the harmony, the combination, who knows, perhaps even a mystical approach to the piece, perhaps the way they discovered it when they were the first time confronted to it. And so everybody has its initiation rites. But in a way, the performer has the responsibility not to be the spokesman for the dead composer and the teacher, sometimes the lawyer, on behalf of the composer's moral rights to make sure you play it correctly. as if the student will by essence be a betrayer by ignorance or by malice. I think that altogether all these concepts are a little bit far-fetched. I personally think that first and foremost, if you want to think that as a parent you know your child best, don't ask his or her friends, his or her spouses, his or her path in life. Because that is the point of living, is to accomplish oneself, of course in service to the community and to be a decent citizen while accomplishing oneself at all levels. That's ideally what one always wishes for oneself and at best for one's own. But the piece composed is not locked in the compositional interpretation of the composer. It's not its property, even if intellectual for a certain amount of years according to legal laws. I think it's sort of like a meaning from a book, or a feeling from a film, or a moral from a fable or a storytelling that nourishes our own food for thought, our behavior in life. Therefore, in our musical life, we have to find how to play and so we can think, okay, the tempo marking, but also the indication of the meter. Perhaps even the metronome, when there is one, is an indication. Well, the teacher has to find a way to not say just to the student who asks, is that supposed to be so fast? As if there is a speed limit. Well, analogies are good for a laugh. I do many of them because I find imagery is easy to correspond for the thought process. But one can not only go by images, one can also go by concepts and say that the counting of the pulse is very important, like the pace. Slow movement. Well, we say slow movement. We know it's a movement that is reflective, that has an aria style genre transcription, so to say, on the piano. Not to be lost in translation, you want to sing the length of the sound that the instrument allows, with or without the pedal. On the modern piano, you can stretch it and have very long vowels. Of course, the meaning of the sentence is where you arrive to make a point. Therefore, the arrival point of the phrase, the punctuation. Therefore, the pace prepares you towards that. If I speak very fast, if I speak very fast, if I speak very fast, if I speak very fast. If I dot the rhythms, I give a character to the piece which becomes driven, perhaps even slightly maniac. But if I do, without the decoration, because that's not fair for the example. Whereas Schumann used to call his own two opposite inner characters, Florestan and Eusebius, you can transform the character of each movement according to your mood. But what do you do when you study? You study style, you study time period, therefore instruments on which was written, how long is the length of the sound of the resonance before the decay, and therefore before it connects to the next note without to create an accent. And every time you have a diminuendo because the sound decays, and you have to catch the next one further lower to avoid. The notation is mattering too. If it's written in eighth notes or in 16th notes or in quarter notes, it's ecological. You see the bar lines as prison bars. Well, most of the music sounds like a flow, thankfully, of a musical thought, storytelling, singing, dance, imitation. It's more danced, it's more sung. not too much. It's in the eye of the beholder. This teacher says that, this recording says that, YouTube University says the third. Well, I'm contributing to add another of those. But I'm trying to be really honest in the sense that I don't want to appear just only biased by my taste. Oh, I like it this way. Because I don't like people playing too slow. I think people will be bored. I don't believe that. But it's just provocatively to say I'm devil's advocate. Or perhaps I don't care about the audience or even about the meaning that Beethoven might have put, and I just play according to my mood of the day if I'm very, 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 very sleepy. Now, the conviction is the first thing in the words that I used when I tried to describe the choice of a tempo. The hypermeter is probably the most important, because even if the bar lines or prison bars organize the music in a visual way on the score, basically evenly sliced, then when you hear it, it's a natural flow of a sentence, not always with the same number of beats. The composer writes phrasings that go beyond the bar lines, which are there just to organize it, I guess, for the eye, mostly for groups who play together to see which bar they can restart to practice. But when you play alone, even if it's published by a score barless, you would still feel the group of bars by the phrasing. For instance, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then for another 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Extension 9, 10. Even Beethoven surprises us. Thankfully, that's why they're geniuses. Not to be guessable, but more or less there are groups of 8, sometimes with extension, sometimes not, or 4 and 4, or 2 and 2. Once you figure that out, you can still decide that you can stretch them or you can stress them. I find it very interesting that the psychological mood of the moment when you play in front of an audience is an excitement. People call it nervous. Some people say they get some adrenaline that drives them. They could play not faster, but rushing. Or like I like to call that for the students, leaning forward. It's a way to thematize the trouble so that the student doesn't feel penalized, but also told you have to count. Who counts? The conductor, but you don't have it when you play alone without orchestra. The metronome, not on the stage, because it would appear like you need somebody else to conduct you. But you have to conduct yourself. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. Count staccato independently if you play second theme legato. 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. And not 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Don't sing your counting, because then you follow your action of the fingers. You want to maintain a leash on the dog and not be driven by the dog when they rush or they slow down. And that's what the conductor does with the orchestra, but he conducts a herd. Here you don't conduct a herd, you conduct yourself. But you conduct yourself in the writing of an orchestra texture or string quartet texture. And I think that it's important that you practice to become your independent counter, and then your performer, the orchestra. All that is very easy to say, very difficult to do, but you have to be practiced. Count, staccato, play as it's written, legato or staccato. Feel the syncopation. 1, 2, 3, 4. If you play the left hand off beat, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Very often pianists think that the note they play is the beat. 1, 2, 3, 4. question if there is a hemiola that enters in the game, like in Schumann Concerto. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So in this counting for the tempo, as I said earlier, it's not just the beats, it's the pulse. The pulse is like the heartbeat. It's not even, but it always goes on. Even if you run or if you're calm, if you're sleeping, of course it changes the tempo, but there is a pace. And I think the continuum of it is most important. And so you can always think, how do I make sense? If I just speak in a foreign language, I hear the sounds, but I understand by hearing a foreign language rather, the sounds without the meaning. So I hear vowels, I hear different type of diphthongs. I find it funny, weird, interesting, intriguing, but I don't get the sense. And so all of a sudden it's like as if instead of playing this in a tonal system, which is the language of most of the classical music, I played. You'll go, what? What's happening? I don't get it. Of course, if you learn it as a foreign language, you will understand it's perhaps a love poem or perhaps it's an insult, but you wouldn't know. Because you would only depend on how it sounds for the beauty of the sounds, a bit like babies in the crib. They learn their mother tongue by ear, mama, papa, whatever is the language, with the amount of no teeth. Of course, you're limited into saying a few vowels, very few consonants, but also it's all by the ear, oral transmission. And I think that when you grow up, you learn the grammar, you learn how to read what you said, you understand the meaning of this word that you used, then you start putting secondary meanings, ironic meanings, thematical meanings from some literature, and all of a sudden the same note. Okay, staccato, but how staccato? Is it pizzicato like on the string? Plum plum, is it? With more air in between to make it more of a perhaps satirical statement. Possibly if you played wet leg staccato. What do you do then? You insist on the fact that there's a character issue, because a composer says staccato, the theorists tell you in their books that it's half the value. So if it is the case, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, so you cut on the end. You're not responsible for the acoustic, because the architect, after all, built the building in which you play, but at least you're responsible for how short and without pedal you play the staccati. So the staccato becomes character issue. Generous, non-legato. Then you can play it also piano. Therefore the dynamics, the articulation, the tempo, the counting come from the pace and the pulse and the direction of the line and the group of bars. In other words, how much spaces you take to tell the sentence, and on which beat you will insist to make it understood. It's the meaningful note. Generally the composer adds a dotted line over the, or dotted beat, or a fermata, stop in Italian, without to define how much. Okay, the theorists tell us could be the double of the value. Then you have this 1.5 bar or 3/4 of a beat. Okay, again, this is the rationale. But then you do it by feeling, because you learn about how to move yourself through the section and what character you want to give to it. Ultimately, you observe analytically the score, not only to write an article about it or perhaps even write a book about it, because it's a thought process and it's food for thought, and I think it's very necessary to think. You cannot transmit thoughts without words and meanings without concepts. So you have to do all this in order to be persuasive. But when you play, you don't talk, thankfully, like. I gave by my own playing 3 different options for the opening. More interrupted silences by notes, or more notes than interrupted silences. A way to capture the attention by the factor that the upbeat is necessarily a jump start, and that the second note is the downbeat. But how do I know that? Because there is nothing before it, the famous silence, pregnant silence. When you accent the downbeat, it becomes almost too explicit. And if you don't, it becomes purposely ambiguous. Is it down or upbeat? Or is it? Or none. And then you think, okay, perhaps the composer didn't want there to be an understanding where it starts. If you see the conductor, they do 2 beats before the downbeat, so the orchestra heard can play together. But you don't see a conductor, so to say, pianist conductor conduct himself and go. And if you do, you would think he or she is eccentric, because you're supposed to do it innerly. Oh, they feel the music, oh, they feel the beat, oh, they feel the speed. I think that feel is the key word to it, comes from that intuition that brought you to play piano in the first place, or to listen to piano, or to enjoy piano, and later to teach piano playing. I would say that analytical understanding is the key to performing. Therefore, the inner ear has then to translate to the outer ear and find that perhaps today, in this situation, in this acoustic, on this instrument, be it not the original one with that length of sound, when you take all the aspects, all the parameters, you say to yourself, okay, I'm going to choose and do that, or this. And at some point, you just are in front of the piano, perhaps with a microphone or an audience or none, or in your practice room, or by yourself, or in front of people, or at an audition, exam, a concert, a performance, a competition, any moment where you think it's the moment to deliver, at the point where you've reached in your musical development the understanding of what you do, and the meaning of what you do, and hopefully convey compellingly to what it means to you. That's where I think the feeling reaches back of the intuition, therefore, with the knowledge. Of course, if the meter is in 8th notes, therefore the values are 8th note and 16th notes in a slow movement, that we know it's played slow by tradition, but we don't know how slow. Then we tell, like conductors to the orchestra, they subdivide the slow, fast beats. Ladies and gentlemen, in 8. And eventually you subdivide. So you beat the beats the musicians don't play in order to organize the spaces between their held notes. And if you do it to yourself, you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 6, 2, 3, 4, 7, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, and you become little by little a ticking metronome in your mind if you subdivide it at such short increments to be precise, because you want to be precise. Millimeters. You want to be, in fact, pulse constant. And then if you subdivide too much, if the left hand of the conductor is the phrasing do, do, la, do, si, la, sol, we for singing so badly, mi, do, re, mi, fa, do, 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 si, 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 la, 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 la. You have one hand to distribute the phrasing, the direction of the line, the punctuation, and the one hand to subdivide the precision of the placement of each value in the subdivision of the beat. So you have the metronome and the feeling, the pace and the meaning. So you indicate to the orchestra the two, and if you do too much subdivision, then obviously the resonance, well, the musicians will play continuously with the bow, and the winds will hold long time the breath. They will start playing on a exhaling because they have to. You don't play a wind instrument by inhaling. Musicians who play on the piano don't have to conduct, but they don't have to either breathe. For instance, most pianists, when they're especially nervous, they inhale and then they hold the breath, catch and stop and stay. Mostly they do that in fast tempi. Quickly exhale, re-inhale and hold it, and then you don't get any irrigation of blood in the brain after a moment. You become almost dizzy because in fact you hold your breath because of the complexity of things you have to play. Rhythmic, articulation, tempo. For instance, last movement is the arpeggio's left hand. And you're so attentive to the movement of the hands, the fingers, the passage of the thumb, the direction of the line, the position of the hand. This time not to do with music, to do with the hand. And I want to make sure that I hold and I have the clear approach to the imprint, because I don't want to play wrong notes, of course. So therefore, combining that kind of attentive, hawk-like attention, I hold my breath. And very often students do that, even performers do that. I try to see if a student can start playing when exhaling slowly, just like a wind instrument would do, or just like an actor would say, long line in a monologue or a dialogue. And I think that helps to organize yourself as if that was your upbeat when you intake and slowly the downbeat. And then you exhale. You inhale and you exhale. It's not like X-ray taking when they say hold your breath, and then after they took the snapshot of your inside, they say now you can exhale. Obviously, this is no physiological necessity to breathe in a certain way if you're not a singer, a wind player, string player even, with a bow being the breath up and down. The pianist seems more disconnected from the action of the playing because it goes through the action, literally, of the instrument. You don't play on the strings, or you don't touch the resonance and the vibration of the note. You imagine it because it's a string quartet. And you project yourself in another reality. Would it be because music of the past is the present when I play it, and at the same time I hear a string quartet in my inner ear, and therefore I project that inspiration, you can call it for lack of better words, or perhaps even daydream, alternative reality, augmented reality, virtual reality. I hear a virtual string quartet in the trio section, so to say, because of three only. In the trio section of the beginning of the minuet, and then 4, and 3, and then 4. And because of the swell of the slur, we call that an hairpin in our jargon. But how much? You're going to tell that very naturally. If you overstate, perhaps. But perhaps if you speak in front of 1,000, 100 or 10 people, you would overstate differently your effects to be eloquent. And so if you just play to yourself, have to say it too much because you talk it to yourself. You don't exclamate inside yourself unless you want to, but that's kind of awkward. But if you try to project, to seduce in a good sense of the word, meaning by conviction and love and not only by affect, a group of people, then immediately the tension of this little crescendo diminuendo of expression, I'll call it hairpin, becomes more aroused. And the appoggiatura, not for another crescendo leading tone. More makeup, more attitude, more lengthen of the loud vowels. Because you want to imitate a minuet, which is a slow dance. In a dance that is very stately, that is danced in courts in Baroque and early classical era. And teachers would say, play elegant. I can play elegant like this too. Perhaps it's to do also with climate, and therefore environmentally define the culture of the place. If it's freezing or very hot, if the culture is to stay outside and think about the world, or stay inside and protect yourself from the intemperate temperatures, then you think less about the world right away, because first you have to be warm, then you have to be fed, then you can think about the world. And I think different interpretations often come also from different cultural characters. In one country, the andante, walking, adagio, with ease, or allegro, joyful or driven, or mostly vivace, vivid, a little bit excited. It's depending of the character, of the temperament of the person, therefore of the culture from which the person comes. So in Germany, very often the classical music, which most of it is German, is performed in tempi that to some other cultures and education of music from Southern Europe or other countries in other parts of the world, the temperament brings them to play a little bit more driven, with a little bit more effect. They find it more, in fact, meaningful. I don't speak about criticizing if it's too fast or too slow. I speak about how meaningful it is, persuasively, to play it. Or now you realize I'm not trying to make fun. I'm not trying to make a point because I like one tempo, so I'm going to mock the other tempo. I try to be finding here conviction in each tempo, and try to appear convinced of it. Like, let's say I want to do it stately and not too driven fast. I want to hold it down, a bit German allegro style. More Italianate. I agree that the cut time, the C with a slash, which is of the key signature, can indicate it's in 2/2 for the half notes as a pace. But the quarter notes, if it's in 4/4, or if it's in between. Not all sections all the time through the movement are the same. When you stop the triplets, which are running in the left hand, broken or chords, of course, arpeggios, then what do you have? You immediately have that section where he interrupts that flow. He doesn't do. Then you would keep that pace. Perhaps all of a sudden you can think in 4, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4, 1, 1, 2, 1. So then comes the question of many students. Am I allowed to change tempi or adjust according to the mood, this thematic material, the different leitmotifs? No, because it's a sonata. It's a sonata like this famous first sonata by Beethoven, which I use as an example for this session. The movement, the section, the mood, the comprehension, the meaning have to all converge. That's the why. The how is the articulation, the counting, the breathing for the spaces between the notes, the preparation of the up or down beat. For instance, this is down beat, but this is upbeat. This is upbeat but stretched, and this is an upbeat but short, just a third of the 3 beats. Because it's more of a dance, you give more pulse down accent to the beat, which is the heavy down beat, and more stretched and unaccented and unsubdivided other than in your inner count, but not in your phrasing of long legato. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Imagine the other side at the end of the piano. You project your dreams of the phrase like the waves of ocean to the horizon line, and you see the horizon line on the sea, and you feel like there is an immensity, and then there is a line towards which you cannot but always fail to approach, because you think the more you go to it, the more you'll catch it, which is what happens when pianists play in rush. It's not just that they don't count, which it is. It is also that even if they do with a conductor and an orchestra, who is there for the orchestra, but because the concerto with the piano collaborates, often the pianist who practiced alone just becomes adjunct, but doesn't always blend. And the conductor tries to keep the pace by counting, as well for the orchestra, then for the pianist, and even so the pianist still rushes. And that is because the pianist doesn't have a bow, doesn't have a breathing iteration, he should only have the fingers, and the fingers just think by themselves when we don't count or we don't organize our thoughts by group of bars. So we can become our own conductor or co-conductor with the orchestra conductor, but therefore even with the conductor we can rush, let less without when we're solo, just playing by ourselves the whole piece. And then how do we remain flexible, because at some point we need to take some time, but how much of that time to suspend ourselves on that dominant, and then we start the tempo from the upbeat in the rest, play the grace notes thematically meaningful and not too tight, not too stretched, but ornamenting, decorating the repeated note, which is meaningful. The word meaningful, more than prettyful, more than cheerful, more than effectful, meaningful. I think that is also because a sonata is a form in which you put characteristic thematic materials. Of course, therefore they have a mood. Again, emotion is not to be disconnected from the pace and the conducting and the understanding of the form. The architect has to have very architectural design in order for the building to hold before it's aesthetic, just to hold without to break by itself or by intemperies. I think that same thing for the performer. You have to remain flexible, as if you're in the wind and the rain and the sunshine, and you stay there and you try to continue going on your journey, and you appreciate the different changes of the light, of the day, of the evening, of the weather, of the rain, of the fog. Of course, some are more difficult to manage when you continue on your journey, but you are in the environment in which you are, changing as it is, and you go from one mood to another. First theme, second theme, conclusive element. Haydn is credited for the first Viennese school form, Sonata Form, the inventor, or at least implementer, and for influencer for most of the early Beethoven and most Mozart's music and others of that time period, and after too, by establishing what we call pure music, or not program music, even if there is a level of program music in everything, but let's say not openly. So therefore you play a form within which you play a mood, within which you play a meaning. And I think you have to always keep in mind these elements in order to create a tempo ecosystem in which all of the different characters can coexist with this quasi unity of pulse. I say quasi because it's not totally possible. Let's say I define the first tempo by 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. Second theme, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. Legato dropping in half major, A flat major with a 6 minor, 6 minor, major. And I try purposely to put together the two contrasting themes, which is the point of the two-theme sonata form that Haydn established with development and recapitulation, where the opposites complete after developing in the development and sort of create the child for the recapitulation in the original key. It's sort of like a mammal reproduction system in music, but not connected to genres like voice, singing, or dancing like the suites, but music for itself. Just like fugue is generated by a single subject that creates its own answer and contra-subject, and therefore you have a sort of a single cell cloning system for developing a fugue whenever the sonata form, in the classical acceptation of the term, is contrasting themes. So the fugue remains more austere. Not that it's not subject to rubato also, because it implements feeling too, of anxiety or tenderness. If you play a fugue very smoothly, like in Beethoven's opening of 1/10 fugue, or in 1/1 fugue. So there is character even within the fugue. There is character because first theme is rambunctious and jumping, one way or another. How much is, again, taste. Second theme is dreaming and singing and dropping in a relative half major, so to say, because of the minor 6 and the major third. But still, the mood is obviously contrasting in a conclusion. At the exposition or at the coda of the end of the movement after the recapitulation. And in the recapitulation, the second theme comes back in minor. When it came in half minor, half major the first time. Not. Nor. But the second time is fully minor. Acknowledging the principal key in the minor mode. And so this contrasts of modes, major, minor, of character, staccato, legato, a subdivision by tips. What are the tips for the subdivision? Perhaps the notation. The composer chooses to notate a slow movement with 8th notes and 16th notes, but they're subdivided, so they're played slower than the quarter notes of the 3/4 of the minuet, which we know is danced at a certain pace, but that is also not totally calibrated in a unique one. And in between that, inside the movement, you can take more time and call it rubato, stealing time, or I think more about take the time to acknowledge a note more in another, to say, oh, you're really meaningful or tender, or punctuating an ending of a sentence, and then you start again. And if you don't do that gently, then it will appear that you're just reciting beats, because the notation is very completely and constantly organized, as if it never stops until the end of the double bar. But the double bar is the very end. In between you have sentences. You can take time between sections. When a pianist performs, keeps a tempo from the inner count. You can feel that there is a structure, like an architect's the undergarments of the building, but not the facade that is differently decorated or not decorated, but you feel like there is a structure. And same thing with the tempo. You know that you you carry yourself through the tracks of the tempo, of the pulse, of the melodies, of the sentences, of the phrasing, of the meaning of the line, of the direction of the line. You count, you subdivide, or you organize the group of bars in hypermeter in terms of how you move yourself in the piece, but you still allow for spaces that are physiological breathing, not metronomical breathing only. And I know we have to be very strict with the score because that's the only thing mostly that connects us to the composer's idea, even if the notation leaves room for interpretation. Hence teaching, or perhaps even influencing, like fashion influences outfits. You influence by saying, no, lately we play this sonata, faster, or because we developed an instrument that allows to repeat easier the notes or something, or you practice technique to manage to play things faster. If there is a meaning to it, depends of your persuasiveness. If you want to play faster than you can, of course it's meaningless. If you play very fast because you can, it could be also meaningless. What is meaningful is that you're in harmony with yourself. The teacher said this, the influence comes from this interpretation, I perhaps like more this, but it's the visible part of the iceberg, whoever plays how. It's what is under the water that prepares for that. And that's what usually you do with a teacher who explains things from the bottom up about the meter, the counting, the breathing, the character, the mood, the comparison, the texture to other textures. If the piano piece is imitating a string quartet or imitating other genre, operatic, or a dance, again. I think all these are the elements that I would suggest very much to students to think about. And then ultimately contradict their teacher if they have to with their conviction. Perhaps not right away, but perhaps on the way, just like children growing contradict to become themselves their own parents, and not willingly or openly sometimes, and perhaps it's healthy, and anyway it should be. Because ultimately the teaching in music is not either to remote control the student, is to give the student the ability to not only say, this is forbidden, it's too fast, or in our tradition we don't do this, or in another tradition they do that. Okay, they can learn about it, they can travel, they can read, they can hear, they can inform themselves. If what you start loving, you don't know how it is, but because you love it, you're curious to know more, and therefore you study, you learn, you understand, you get influenced, you change your opinions even, because you grow up with the piece, and the piece reveals itself differently to you from the child or the young man if you start it whenever, or you teach it, or you perform it, or you record it, and you listen to the mirror of your playing, and you say, it's not what I wanted. But while you play, you don't hear it the way you really hear it because you play it. Therefore, the industry of playing overtakes some of the objective listening quality which the recording gives you. I mean, you could write about the piece rather than play it. You can record it rather than perform it in front of an audience. Or you can practice it in your room and think about what it means, or not understand what it means, or need somebody to decode you what it could mean. And ultimately, not say as a recitant, oh, I was told to play for you this because it's in cut time, in this and that mood, indicated by the composer in this and that language, that I translate as lively. But since the composing of the piece in 1820s or 1810s or 1800s, and today we have been much more driven by effects that sensorially make us more excited. We've been on faster speeds, we've been on louder noises situations, we've been on striking psychological contrasts of life, dramas or happinesses. So we live in our own time. And so it's difficult to just freeze and go back in a museum style and play it like they heard it in their own time capsule without all what we heard since. But today we, in fact, carry heavier luggage, and we have to sort of define what stylistically makes the difference between a staccato in Beethoven on a piano he didn't have, for an audience that also has heard staccati in Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. The very concept of dissonance, consonance evolves with the acquaintance to the or the way the ear and the psyche gets adjusted with the dissonance, therefore also with a certain aspect of music being the reflection of its environment. And then when people ask, should I play the repeat? Oh, it's too long, or I'll be boring if I don't do differently the second time. All these aspects, I think, are useless, because you shouldn't. You should play the repeat as if the piece continues. The storytelling is there, even if it repeats itself, is to mean something more heavily, but then continues. And so I think that, or then perhaps we should just play and say that's a sonata first movement. I don't have to play more. But by the time I'm more explicit, then I play more notes and I get to play more meaning. After the first fermata, I could say, okay, I've done that, I can go to the second theme. No, I have to do it on the dominant. I don't have to, the score does tell me, and I do it because it tells me, so I'm obedient. So in fact, I speak through the words of the author, just like a theater actor or a film actor telling the lines that they didn't write, but they tell it so believably that the listener is out of the rupture of disbelief. They think you really are saying what you are, and you really mean. I recall Richter playing this piece and looking at the audience with sort of like stained glass eyes, which is like singers see an audience when they face, unlike the pianist, sideways. But he would face the audience before he starts, looking at them, through them, beyond them, into that horizon line of our daydream imagination, where our melodic line or our thematic material brings us to. And then all of a sudden he would look at the audience and start. As if his gaze is in another place and his playing is in this place, and somehow in this triangle between the piece, the piano, and the audience, he brings us to it, even if he could play it closed eyes or just looking down on his fingers to count the 10 fingers, as I like to make fun of. You have to look somewhere unless you close your eyes, or you look in front of you. But it doesn't matter, because what you see is not what you see, it's what you hear that goes through your eyes gaze. And if you hear something that is tender, you don't laugh or smile. The gentleness of this opening naturally makes you feel more gentle. And the drive almost gallop of this movement, besides the breathing and perhaps makes your face also reflect differently what you play. Not that you have to act like a clown or a silent film actor to overstate all the feelings through the face and the way you project your gaze. But it's part of it. You live with the piece. You receive the piece, you transmit the piece, and you're a living membrane between the piece and the audience. Therefore, what tempo you'll choose might be tainted by the mood of the moment to a certain extent. Of course, also by your knowledge and your technique, how you're going to organize, and what you understood from the intelligent score reading through good teaching, and then therefore through even analytical interpretation option that comes from what you've gathered from all this information to become believably yourself. Even if you didn't write the piece, you didn't decide the interpretation, or perhaps you feel innerly that it's not corresponding in this style to what your musical calling calls you for. Like some people don't feel the rubato that is taking some space around the beat at some point, and perhaps it's too much zigzagging, and some others like to go just more straighter into the meaning of the piece. As I say, everybody sees in a piece or hears in a piece different aspects that they drive him towards the piece or her. Is it the rhythm? Is it the melody? Is it the harmony? The combination, but not always in the same order, and perhaps not always in the same amount. But there is something going on in the brain through the soul and the fingers. So you have to have the mechanical technique to not betray your musical intuition or your musical knowledge through the intuition as well. And then keep counting, and then find a way to be storytelling within the limitation of the notation, and without to worry only about what the composer wanted. Since most of the performed composers we play are dead, it's easy to say that's what they wanted. Even if we are very documented, less documented, or scholarly knowledgeable, there comes the moment you have to play, which is my favorite part, without to explain.